Would you rather be on the wrong end of a poster dunk
To Brandon Jennings, behind him to Josh. Man, Chris came and get out of the way.
My goodness! Josh!
or have your shot sent into the third row?
Just set up. Give me that.
Just have to learn to live with rejection.
By Smith, who leads the league in block shots.
For a lot of players, the choice was made for them. Then later that night, they'd be on SportsCenter, courtesy of Josh Smith. A quote, dangerous mix of graceful athleticism and raw power. Josh Smith was one of the best finishers in league history and an underrated defender. When he got to the rim, it was a done deal, racking up endless highlights over 9 seasons with the Atlanta Hawks, turning them into a perennial playoff contender in the late 2000s. But he was at his best when he was attacking and protecting the rim. So when an inconsistent perimeter shot started taking over his game, he saw his value drop as he would bounce around a few teams and the league would move on from him quickly. But Atlanta Hawks' Josh Smith was must-see basketball, as he'd routinely give fans their money's worth off a single play. Let's jog your memory. The son of former ABA player Pete Smith, Josh Smith's rising talent on the Georgia basketball courts would see him suit up for a few high schools during his teen years. He would start at Whitefield Academy before transferring to McEachern High midway through his sophomore season, and really put himself on the map as a junior, putting up some monster numbers as a two-way star, which led to an invite to the ABCD camp over the summer. And when he wasn't playing ball there, he was teaming up with other top recruits in Dwight Howard and Randolph Morris on the Atlanta Celtics AAU team, as Josh Smith was going into his senior season as one of the highest rated players in the nation. And to further his basketball career, he would transfer to Oak Hill Academy, along with another future NBAer named Rajon Rondo. But initially, it seemed like Smith's next stop after high school would be Indiana, announcing his intention to commit to the Hoosiers in July of 2003. Yet there were some who still thought that he'd skip the college route altogether. But for the time being, Smith was a warrior and was physically head and shoulders above the competition in an offense that gave him a lot more freedom than he had at McEachern. And unsurprisingly, Oak Hill was running opponents out of the gym, and head coach Steve Smith was putting his star forward in rare company when talking about his physical gifts. And it didn't take long to understand why that comparison was made, as at 6'8" with a 40-inch vert, Smith did some things on the court that didn't seem possible, with mobility and length, which guaranteed that he was never out of a play, as on top of multiple highlight reel dunks each game, no shot was safe when Smith was on the court. And by the end of the season, Oak Hill had a 38-0 record, and Smith had spent the season stuffing the stat sheet, as he was named both a first-team parade All-American and a McDonald's All-American. And while he was supposed to go to Indiana, he was also now projected as a lottery pick, as part of a high school class with many players expected to go in the first round. And the reality of going straight to the league was too good to pass up, as Smith withdrew his commitment to Indiana and instead entered the 2004 NBA draft.
With the 17th pick in the 2004 NBA draft, the Atlanta Hawks select Josh Smith from Oak Hill Academy.
So in a draft that was taken over by high schoolers, the 18-year-old Smith wouldn't even be leaving home after being drafted by the Atlanta Hawks as the second Josh that they had drafted, with the team also selecting Josh Childress earlier in the draft. But these Hawks weren't going to be challenging for a title anytime soon. However, they had acquired a couple solid offensive players during the offseason in Al Harrington and Antoine Walker. But with a new coach in Mike Woodson, and overall one of the weakest rosters in the league, expectations were low. And while Smith was one of the most impressive athletes to ever enter the NBA, his athleticism had also helped mask a lot of his weaknesses in high school, as he had some pretty strong critics from the moment he was drafted, specifically Jay Billis. But to be fair, the level of athlete in high school is not even comparable to what Smith would face for 82 games each year in the pros. So how would his athleticism-dependent game translate at the next level? And at just 18 years old, Smith definitely had a lot of development to do. But he would do that development on the court, as after performing well in Summer League, Smith began the regular season getting major minutes, and by early December, he was made a starter and never looked back. And even in the NBA, his athleticism was still top tier, with many of his points coming from putback dunks and transition slams. And his blocks on the other end were just as exciting as his dunks, as just like in high school, he was never out of a play, with his 1.9 blocks even leading all rookies, as he would even record a career-high 10 blocks in a December 18th loss to Dallas. And his above-the-rim play would be on full display at All-Star Weekend, both in the rookie-sophomore game and the dunk contest. And in the dunk contest, he would wow fans with his vertical and power, even paying tribute to another incredible Hawks dunker.
And give up the respect to Dominique all at the same time.
As he would take home the title of Slam Dunk King. Then shortly afterwards, Antoine Walker was traded away, so Smith would get an increased role and would up his numbers across the board over his final 29 games. However, Smith was one of the only reasons fans would come to Hawks games, as Atlanta would manage just 13 wins on the season, and Smith would be named second-team All-Rookie behind averages of about 9.5 points, 6 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game. Atlanta made a big splash during the offseason as they would acquire Joe Johnson from the Phoenix Suns, and while they had the second pick in the draft and an opportunity to select a franchise point guard like Chris Paul or Darren Williams, they would instead select another forward in Marvin Williams. But Smith's season would see him act as the team's starting small forward while also spending time at the 4. But as he didn't really have the consistent shooting touch you'd like in a wing player, he would rely as much as he could on his physical gifts. But it would only take him so far, as he saw his shooting drop to below 43%. But his numbers were going up, and in year 2, he had become one of the league's most dangerous shot blockers, as whether it was meeting someone at the rim or catching up to them for a chase down, Josh Smith often came out on top as a top 5 shot blocker in the league. And while he would get a chance to defend his slam dunk crown, he would not repeat as champion. But the Hawks were heading in the right direction. They had a go-to scorer in Joe Johnson and had Smith becoming more comfortable in his role, making hustle plays and shifting momentum when Atlanta needed it, as an improved Hawks offense would see them double their win total from last year. And while it was still just 26 wins, it was what you wanted to see, as year 2 had seen Smith average about 11.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks per game. But going into year 3, Josh Smith was expected to make a huge jump, no pun intended. So Al Harrington was gone, which meant a lot of scoring was gone, and the man tasked with replacing that scoring was Josh Smith. A second-year Marvin Williams would also enter the starting lineup, and Smith would begin as a small forward, playing on the wing and taking advantage of his athleticism before eventually transitioning to power forward as the season went on. But overall, he became the team's second leading scorer and top rebounder, and his shot blocking numbers just continued to rise, whether it was rejecting his own man or swatting away someone else's shot when he provided help defense. Josh Smith was an eraser, finishing second in the NBA with a career-high 2.9 blocks per game, recording 9 games with at least 5 blocks. However, while Smith was getting his points, it was still on less than 44% shooting, as while he was taking more shots, his shot selection was questionable, too often getting away from his aggressive attack-the-rim style and instead settling for long jumpers, which head coach Mike Woodson was not a fan of. And with Childress and Williams missing significant time this year, the Hawks' only truly reliable scorer was Joe Johnson, and it showed in their offense, as they were the NBA's lowest scoring team in 07. But on the other end, Smith was anchoring a much improved defense, who were helping the Hawks get some gritty wins and continue to show overall improvement, as they would crack 30 wins this season. But the frustrations were still there, as Smith would even be suspended near the end of the year for a blow-up with Coach Woodson. But overall, Smith wrapped up his season with averages of about 16.5 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 3 blocks per game. But things were coming together in Atlanta, and with a new big man and rebrand, it was a new era of Hawks basketball. Atlanta brought in Al Horford through the draft, filling their most glaring need, which was a consistent center, and Smith would make the full transition to power forward in 08, and the improvement continued, upping his scoring for the 4th consecutive season, and again acting as a top shot blocker in the league. And while he wouldn't pull down as many rebounds as you'd like, if Smith wasn't in position for a rebound when a shot went up, it was likely because he was already leaking out to get a full head of steam for a potential transition dunk. And while he didn't have the polished post game of a power forward, he could still face up and take advantage of his quickness against slower big men, so Smith was routinely scoring in double figures, even dropping a career-high 38 points just a couple weeks into the season against Milwaukee, and putting up his first career triple-double versus Denver in late January. But with the addition of Horford, the Hawks' weakest position had now become point guard, so they tried to address that in mid-February, as they would acquire longtime king Mike Bibby, and with the scoring and passing that Bibby brought, the Hawks were able to remain competitive and finish at 37-45, which ended up being enough for the East's final playoff spot and a first-round matchup with Boston. And after 2 poor showings to kick off his postseason debut, Smith went off in the first playoff game in Atlanta in 9 years, as Boston didn't know what hit them in Game 3.
15 feet. Celtics hit 5 of there. Bibby is able to come up with it. He's got Smith again with the block from behind. Smith! Bad time for a turnover.
Smith was dunking everything, en route to 27 points and a win. Then after Smith put up 28 points in Game 4, Atlanta had shockingly knotted it up. However, Smith would see his play decline the rest of the series, as Atlanta pushed Boston to 7 games, but would eventually lose, with Smith's year ending with him averaging about 17 points, 8 rebounds, and 3 blocks per game. Over the offseason, a restricted free agent Smith would accept an offer sheet with the Memphis Grizzlies, but the Hawks would match it to keep Smith in Atlanta long term, as the Hawks were making sure they would have the same starting lineup in 08, and they would get a full season with Bibby leading the offense. And while Smith's numbers dropped, Atlanta played a team game, with 6 guys averaging at least 11 points, and their defense continued to improve. And while Smith would never again reach the shot blocking numbers he had been putting up over his first 4 seasons, a lot of guys just knew not to shoot when Smith was around. And while he wasn't blocking as many shots, he was forcing opponents to take bad shots, and would often end up on the perimeter, with his ability to switch and defend smaller, quicker players. And Smith was still the Hawks' second leading scorer, and was again attacking the rim, putting up a then career-high shooting percentage. And the Hawks weren't an Eastern Conference laughingstock anymore, beginning the season with 6 straight wins, and closing out their season by winning 4 of their final 5, to finish at 47-35, and get a return to the playoffs to take on Miami. Atlanta was in for another battle, and Smith would be up and down. He would hit double figures in all but 1 game, and would start off the series with double-doubles in each of the first 2 games, as the team split the first 2 in Atlanta. But over the next 4, Smith would shoot below 30%, yet he would still get his points at the free throw line. But for the second straight year, Atlanta was heading to Game 7. However, this time it was at home, and Smith would have an efficient 21-9 in a win, as Atlanta was on to the second round. But in round 2, they would run into league MVP LeBron James and the Cavs. Yet aside from a poor Game 2, Smith would be arguably the Hawks' best player in this series, finishing as their leading scorer and shot blocker, and dropping an efficient 26 points with 8 rebounds in Game 4. But with both Marvin Williams and Al Horford banged up, the Hawks went down quietly in a sweep, as Smith's year had ended with him averaging about 15.5 points, 7 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game. So the Hawks had their core in place, and heading into a new decade, Josh Smith would have the best year of his career. The Hawks' starting lineup again looked the same in 2010, and were often on the court together, as all 5 starters appeared in at least 76 games. And now they had some serious offense coming off the bench, as they had also brought in Jamal Crawford, who would win his first 6th Man of the Year award. And with so much added offense and shooting, it only made the game easier for Smith, as he would have more one-on-ones down low and turn in the only season of his career shooting over 50%. But when the defense did collapse, he had shooters to kick it out to, and as he was also often the ball handler on the break, he would average a career-high 4.2 assists, while even having the best rebounding season of his career, as some of his rebounds this season would also double as some of his most memorable plays of his career.
For another game winner, he puts it up, it is no good, jam follow Josh Smith, count the basket, and the Hawks have done it again!
Then on the defensive end, he could effectively guard both forward positions, and overall had the versatility to switch almost everything on defense. And for the final time in his career, he would average at least 2 blocks, while also adding a career-high 1.6 steals, as he would finish as runner-up to Dwight Howard for Defensive Player of the Year. Yet this second-place finish would only get him a second-team All-Defense selection. However, his teammates knew how valuable he was, with Jamal Crawford even comparing him to one of the greatest defensive anchors in sports history. But overall, this was the best the Hawks had looked since the late 90s, as they had an efficient offense and a disciplined defense, and proved it with a 53-29 record and a first-round matchup with Milwaukee. But for the third straight season, their first-round series went 7 games. The Hawks won both in Atlanta as Smith turned in 2 double-doubles, which included a 21-point, 14-rebound, and 9-assist performance on 9 of 11 shooting in Game 2. But he shot below 39% over the next 3, as Milwaukee won each game, and now Atlanta had their backs against the wall. And while Smith only averaged about 12 points over the final 2 games, he continued playing great defense, averaging nearly 2.5 blocks for the entire series, as Atlanta won the final 2 games to advance to a second-round matchup with Orlando. So it was the DPOY versus the runner-up. But the Magic's offense made few mistakes, as Dwight Howard missed 5 shots all series, and Orlando as a whole shot over 53%. And while Smith had a good offensive series, in the end, the Hawks were dominated, again being swept out of the second round, as Smith's career year ended with him averaging about 15.5 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game. After being swept out of the playoffs in 2 consecutive seasons, the Hawks would decide to move on from Mike Woodson and replace him with Larry Drew. But as the 2011 season went on, it was looking like the previous season may have been the peak of this iteration of the Hawks. Horford was playing great, but Johnson would have the worst scoring season of his career up to that point. Yet they did still have Crawford, and Smith had slightly upped his scoring to finish second on the team. But Atlanta's point guard situation was again uncertain after an aging Bibby was traded away mid-season and replaced with Kirk Heinrich. Smith continued as a great defensive player for the Hawks, and overall the Hawks continued as a great defensive team. But offensively, they were now near the bottom of the league in team scoring. And with Marvin Williams struggling with injury, Smith spent more time at the 3, and after the best season of his career had seen him attempt just 7 3-pointers, with more time on the perimeter this season, he would attempt a then career-high 154 threes, and would hit them at a respectable, yet also career-high 33.1% clip. But overall with Smith, the good outweighed the bad, and while Atlanta's offense had regressed, their defense was still enough to get them into the playoffs with a 44-38 record, as they got a rematch with Orlando. But this time Atlanta did things differently, and while Howard got his points, the Hawks made sure everyone else struggled to get theirs, as Orlando would only shoot about 40% as a team. Smith would have a modest offensive series, averaging about 14 points on 42% shooting, but he was active on the glass and was Atlanta's best defender, as he would help hold Hedo Turkoglu to below 30% shooting. And with Atlanta in position to win the series at home in Game 6, Smith made the most important stop of his career.
Turkoglu bounces it in. Tough shot blocked. Ball game's over!
So Smith's block pushed Atlanta through to a second-round matchup with Derrick Rose and the Chicago Bulls, and the Hawks ensured there'd be no sweep after stealing Game 1 in Chicago, but Chicago would get back on track with 2 straight wins. Yet the Hawks evened it after Smith put up 23 points, 16 rebounds, and 8 assists in Game 4. Unfortunately, while Smith was solid in the final 2 games, Chicago would close out the Hawks in 6, as Smith's season ended with him averaging about 16.5 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game. So while it had been a disappointing end for Atlanta, one thing the Chicago series did was bring them their new point guard, as the now third-year Jeff Teague would be their starter, after playing great versus Chicago last year. Unfortunately, Crawford was gone, and injury limited Horford to 11 games. But even after an off-season of trade rumors, Smith was still there, and would be their go-to big man more than ever, as he put up career highs in both scoring and rebounding, and he would even tie with Johnson for the team lead in scoring, as Smith would have 8 games with at least 30 points and 28 double-doubles. And even with the roster changes, the offense would actually be better in 2012, and their defense would be the best it would ever be during Smith's time with the Hawks, and it was reflected in their play, as even in a lockout-shortened 66-game season, they would reach 40 wins, and would get a playoff matchup with the Celtics, Over the first 2 games, Smith was averaging 19 points and 15 boards, as the series was tied. But Smith sprained his knee in Game 2 and would miss Game 3, which Boston won. Then while Smith returned for the rest of the series and continued cleaning up on the glass, he wasn't 100%, and the Celtics knocked off the Hawks in 6 games, as Smith's year ended with him averaging about 19 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game. But going into the following season, Smith became a lot more important to the team's success. The offseason would see Joe Johnson traded to the Nets, as Smith would have to shoulder a lot more of the offensive load in 2013. Luckily, Horford was healthy, and Atlanta had added shooting by bringing in Kyle Korver, as well as some bench scoring with the addition of Lou Williams. However, Williams would miss more than half the season, so Smith was still an offensive focal point and would lead the team in scoring, while being their second best rebounder and distributor. But the Hawks were becoming one of the highest volume 3-point shooting teams in the league, and Smith was very involved in that, surpassing 200 attempted threes for the first time in his career, yet only making about 30% of them. And defensively, a Hawks team which had normally been great at defending against the perimeter shot would struggle this year, as they had more of an average defense to go along with their average offense, which led to a pretty average record at 44-38, but it was still enough for another playoff appearance and a matchup with an up-and-coming Pacers team. Smith was playing well over the first 4 games, shooting over 50% and averaging over 18 points, while even dropping a postseason career-high 29 points in a Game 4 win to even the series, and playing good defense, while doing it all on a bad ankle. But after Game 4, his shot stopped falling, and he shot 5 of 16 from the field in back-to-back games, which both ended in Hawks losses, as the Pacers closed them out in 6, and Smith's season ended with him averaging about 17.5 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game. But now Smith's contract was up, and after years of seeing his name in trade rumors, Smith was growing frustrated with the organization, further confirmed by a suspension he had received in mid-January. So it seemed like the now free agent Smith and the Hawks were both in agreement that it was best to go their separate ways. In early July, Smith signed a big 4-year deal with the Pistons, as GM Joe Dumars really liked the versatility that Smith could provide on both ends of the court. And at the time of the signing, Smith's career numbers had been the definition of versatile, as he was considered one of the most prized free agents of the 2013 offseason, which was a busy offseason for the Pistons, as a few weeks after the Smith signing, they would trade to acquire point guard Brandon Jennings. But now Smith became part of a weird 3-forward lineup, which had Smith playing the 3, while Greg Monroe and Andre Drummond played the 4 and 5. But now Detroit was expecting Smith to create more off the dribble as a wing player, when he had spent years in Atlanta playing the 2-man game and beating slower forwards in the post. And while he didn't really have the ball handling to get past quicker defenders on the perimeter, even when he did, the lane was often clogged up with Monroe and Drummond. So Smith did what a lot of wing players were doing in a changing league, which was take the 3-pointer. And as he wasn't the best shooter, it was often open, with his 265 total threes and 3.4 attempts per game, both being career highs. Yet he only made about 26% of them. He still was the team's leading scorer, but it was on the worst shooting percentage of his career up to that point. And while Smith could be a good rebounder and great shot blocker, he put up career lows in these categories as well, as he was spending much more time on the perimeter on the defensive end as well. So while Smith had some exciting moments and some big games, overall it wasn't looking like a great fit, as the Pistons finished with a 29-53 record, with Smith's first year in Detroit seeing him average about 16.5 points, 7 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game. But over the offseason, Pistons ownership went full front office overhaul and brought in Stan Van Gundy as both head coach and president. So Smith began the season as the Pistons starter, but was playing extremely inefficiently, as he was looking to shoot whenever he touched the ball. And while he wasn't taking as many threes as last year, he was settling for even worse shots, with a lot of long twos, as after 28 games, he was on pace for a historically bad season. But it wouldn't be with Detroit, as in late December, the Pistons waived Smith, with over 2 years left on his contract, as he and Van Gundy had been clashing all season.
People around the league didn't think Josh Smith and Stan Van Gundy, who came in as president and coach this year, would click. And they didn't. They clashed immediately.
To the point that Van Gundy was willing to take on the $30 million cap hit that came from releasing Smith. But just days later, Smith was scooped up by the Houston Rockets, who featured both James Harden and Smith's friend Dwight Howard. And for the first time in his career, Smith was coming off the bench. And while he was still inefficient, he was much better than he had been in Detroit, and gave Houston a valuable two-way guy on their second unit and someone who could play the pick and roll like Howard, as Smith would play a big role in his final 55 games with the Rockets, and Houston would finish with a 56-26 record and get a first-round matchup with Dallas. Smith would continue coming off the bench in this series, but was extremely valuable to the Rockets, acting as their second leading scorer on over 51% shooting, while even shooting over 39% from deep. Houston jumped out to a 3-0 lead. Then even though Smith went for 23 points on 80% shooting in Game 4, Dallas avoided the sweep. But after another efficient 20-point performance from Smith, Houston wrapped it up in 5 and advanced to a second-round matchup with the Clippers. This was a completely different series for Smith, as after 4 games, he was averaging less than 7 points, and the series looked all but over, with the Clippers up 3-1. But Smith entered the starting lineup in Game 5, and Houston extended the series. Then in Game 6, Smith dropped 19 points with 4 3-pointers, as 14 of those points came in the fourth quarter, and Houston pulled off an incredible comeback to force a Game 7. Then they would take care of business in Game 7, as Smith had 15 points in a win, and now Houston was on to the conference finals to take on Golden State. Smith continued as a starter, and while his overall shooting was poor, he was a 40% shooter from deep, and would average nearly 15 points per game, once again as Houston's second leading scorer, as he would even have a 20-point Game 4 on 7 of 8 shooting, to get Houston their first win of the series. But there'd be no comeback this time, as Golden State won in 5, and Smith's overall season ended with him averaging about 12.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game. Smith's playoff performance got him a deal with the Clippers going into the following season, but in LA, he would get the lowest minutes of his career and grew frustrated at his limited opportunity, as he was putting up the worst numbers of his career in his limited action. But in late January, he was back in Houston after a trade, yet it wasn't the same, as Houston had fired Smith's coach from last year in Kevin McHale, and under interim coach JB Bickerstaff, Smith's minutes were still quite limited due to his inefficient play, as he was jacking up nearly 4 threes per game, and the Rockets struggled to a 41-41 record, but got a first-round matchup with Golden State. However, this year, Smith didn't really play any meaningful minutes, and appeared in just 4 of the 5 games in a series loss, as his season wrapped up with him averaging about 6 points, 3.5 rebounds, and a block per game. But just a few years after being a top free agent, Josh Smith didn't garner much NBA interest, so he spent the 2017 season in China, and while he was scoring and rebounding with ease, he was letting that 3-point shot fly like never before. And while he was still better than the league he was playing in, his shot selection continued to make it hard for NBA teams to warrant his signing, as he remained without a team until the following year, when he would sign with the Pelicans days before the 2018 season. However, after just a few weeks, he was waived, as his 3 games had seen him average about half a point and 1.5 rebounds per game. And that was the end of Josh Smith's NBA career. He had played an impressive 13 years, but as he was still about a month shy of his 32nd birthday, it felt premature. And while it was a 3-point shooting league, Smith hadn't showed that he could consistently hit the shot that he had grown to love. He would later appear in Ice Cube's Big 3 league, but that was it for Smith's basketball career. Fortunately, he has revealed on podcasts in more recent years that even as a player straight out of high school, he was smart with his money and is financially comfortable, which is probably the best accomplishment a retired player can have. Josh Smith is one of the greatest athletes to ever play in the NBA. You can make the argument that he may have developed a more polished game had he gone to college, but his physical gifts were still enough to make him a successful NBA player. And it's not to say he never improved his skills. It was more so that he didn't play to his obvious strengths nearly as much as he should have, as when Josh Smith was slashing and attacking, he was hard to stop. But even with the offensive struggles, Josh Smith was one of the better defenders of his era and probably should have been on a couple more all-defense teams. and unfortunately, his career decline has seemed to overshadow his great years in Atlanta. And while they never got over the hump, Josh Smith helped them out of the NBA cellar, and at the end of the day, was a player who got you out of your seat, and every fan can appreciate that. But that's it for today's episode on Josh Smith. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Hawks teammates, or this one on another Oak Hill alum. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.